Mike, Tony, and Rube, three best friends since the third grade, were now 11 years old. They hung out at the park almost every Saturday and played basketball and jumped hills on their bikes. It was the best of times for them. They were worry and carefree boys who thought they were in the prime of their lives. Little did they know, all that was about to change this fall. The events that would take place over the next months would change their lives forever and devastate their town. Hey, that new Alien movie is about to come on. Let's go to my house and watch it. My mom said she'll order us pizza, Mike said. Tony perked up. From where? You know I'm picky about my pizza. Man, whatever, Rube said. You are not picky. You eat gas station hot dogs. The boys laughed and got on their bikes and headed out to Mike's house. Hey, let's take the old farm road back. It's quicker, Mike suggested. Tony scrunched up his face. Man, I hate taking that road, especially going past Mr. Grady's house. It always stinks, and sometimes when he's outside and standing in his yard, he just stands there smiling. He's such a weird old man, Rube laughed. Ah, poor baby, scared of a little old man. He's got those pigs in back of his house. That's what you're smelling. He is weird though. My dad said he fell off a horse when he was little and hit his head, and he ain't been right since. Well, I heard he's been in that house so long by himself, he married one of those pigs and does stuff with it, and he's sick now. That's what's wrong with him, Tony joked. The boys laughed and headed off down to the old farm road. The road was surprisingly smooth. There wasn't many cars that traveled along it, so the roads were much better. Upon passing Mr. Grady's house, the boys could smell a foul odor coming from the place. You could see the pen that he kept the pigs in and a few goats. There was also an old well in the back of the house. I just don't see how he lives there with that smell, Tony said. How do you think he even eats? The boys just shook their head and rode on past Mr. Grady's house. Back at the park, a woman and her two kids had arrived. She was sitting on the bench while her two young children played on the swings. Mommy, take a picture of us, the little girl said while swinging higher and higher. Hold on, baby. Let Mommy get her camera out. The woman dug into her purse to retrieve her phone. Oh, darn. I must have forgotten it in the car. I'm going to go get my phone out of the car, okay? You two stay right there. I'll be right back. Okay, Mommy, the little girl yelled out as the woman went to get her phone from the car. The little girl stopped swinging, hopped off the swing and ran to the jungle gym. Her brother continued to swing. As the woman made it back and prepared to take pictures of her kids, she saw that her daughter was now on the jungle gym. Where's your brother? She asked. He's still on the swing, the little girl said. The woman looked over at the swing set, but the little boy was gone. The swing was still swinging by itself. The look of concern came over the woman's face. She looked around, but the little boy was nowhere to be seen. She ran over to the swing set and grabbed the empty swing. She looked down and saw a messy area of dirt under the swing and large shoe prints that trailed away from the swing set. She began to panic. Ethan! Ethan! The woman yelled. What's wrong, Mommy? The little girl said. She had came and stood next to her mother and was now holding her hand. Ethan! She screamed. But he was gone. Ethan was gone. The next morning, while at church with his family, Mike noticed that his mother's friend was crying and her husband looked distressed. Mom, your friend is crying, he whispered. His mother looked over at the woman and made eye contact with her. After service, they went and talked to the woman and her husband. Judy, are you okay? We saw you crying. Is something the matter? His mother asked. The woman wiped her eyes. She began to speak, but broke down again. Her husband patted her back. Ethan was kidnapped yesterday, he said, fighting back his own tears. What? Mike's dad said. Kidnapped? Mike's parents looked at each other in shock. Yes. Someone took him while they were at the park yesterday. The police have no leads. There was no witnesses. It's like he just disappeared. Oh my God, Phil, I'm so sorry to hear that, Mike's mother said. Is there anything we can do? Just keep us in your prayers. And please, let us know if you hear anything at all. Judy, I'm so sorry, Mike's mother said. Judy just shook her head and wiped her tears. I just want my son back. Mike said nothing about him and his friends being at the park the other day. He knew it was the same park because he'd seen them there before. He was scared. It didn't feel real. The next day while at school, he told Tony and Rube about the kidnapping. Man, we were just there the other day. What if the kidnapper was already there watching us, hiding somewhere, Tony said. Rube looked at the other two. Well, I'm staying away from that park. Nobody's going to kidnap me. Nobody wants you, Rube. You eat too much. Nobody can afford to feed you. Tony joked. The boys laughed, but deep down the kidnapping bothered them, and it weighed heavily on their minds. Months went by, and things started to die down a bit. People began to think that it was an outsider that took the boy, someone just passing through. It made people feel more comfortable to believe that than to think there was a dangerous child predator living among them. While on their way to visit friends, Mike's family took the old farm road and passed Mr. Grady's house. They saw the old man standing in his backyard, talking to someone. I guess old Grady's got some company today. That's a surprise. All my years, I don't think I've ever seen anyone at that man's house, Mike's dad said. Poor thing. He's got to be lonely all by himself in that old house, his mom said. When they passed the house, Mike looked back to see that Mr. Grady actually wasn't talking to anyone. Though he appeared to be having a conversation with someone, there was no one there. He appeared to be talking to the old well behind his house. His parents didn't see this. Mike just turned around and kept quiet. After visiting friends on their way back home, the family stopped off at the grocery store for a few things. While walking through the parking lot, Mike saw an old, faded burgundy truck. As they got closer, someone walked around the side of the truck and stopped. It was Mr. Grady. The old man stood there holding a large bag of potatoes. He almost had a lost look on his face. He was clean-shaven, which only exposed his hardened, wrinkled face. He stood there expressionless, staring at the family. And then he smiled. It sent a chill down Mike's spine. His smile was not pleasant. It was unnerving. He looked under-eyed under the brim of his old baseball cap, his teeth barely visible behind his thin, withered lips. How you folks doing? Mr. Grady said. Fine, Mr. Grady. We're doing just fine, Mike's dad said as they passed him. The foul smell of pigs and whatever else surrounded him. As they passed, Mr. Grady focused on Mike. He looked at the boy as if he knew him. There was sympathy in his eyes, but there was also something much darker. The look made Mike very uncomfortable. Mr. Grady seemed to lose focus, mumbled something to himself, got into his truck and left. Later that day, a local family was having a birthday party for one of their children. It was a big party with lots of kids. They had even rented a bouncy castle for the kids to play in. The party had run later than expected and into the night. The house sat on plenty of land for the kids to run around and play on, and connected to a wooded area out back. One little boy left the bouncy castle and began to walk around the back. Where are you going, Joshua? Another boy asked. I gotta go pee, he responded. But the house is back that way, the boy said. I know, but I gotta pee really bad. I'm just gonna go behind that tree over there. Aren't you scared of coyotes? They come out at nighttime, you know. I'm not scared of coyotes. They're just skinny dogs. Plus, I can run super fast, Joshua said as he ran into the shadows of the trees. As Joshua finished up and was zipping up his pants, He heard a branch crack on the ground behind him. He turned and saw a dark figure standing in the trees. "Hi," the soft voice said. "What you doing out here all by yourself?" Joshua, overcome with fear, gulped. I had to pee." The person came a little closer. "I was just looking for my son. He's about your age. Have you seen him?" The person said while holding out a picture of a young boy. "Here, take a look. Maybe you recognize him." Joshua slowly reached out for the picture. As his fingers touched it, the person grabbed his wrists. Joshua started to scream, and quickly the person covered his mouth and knocked him to the ground. The boy looked up at the person. Tears ran down his cheeks. I want my mommy." Then he was quickly picked up, and they disappeared into the dark woods. The town was in an uproar. This was the second child to disappear in 4 months. The police were baffled. There was never any evidence left behind, no witnesses, and no suspects. They patrolled and did search parties, but nothing ever came of it. The kids were just gone, and there seemed to be nothing they could do about it. 3 months had gone by, and things seemed to be getting back to normal, but people were still on edge. Mike, Tony, and Rube were hanging out one night at Tony's house when it got a little dark and time to go. Mike called his parents to pick him up. They didn't want him coming home late by himself anymore. "Hey, Rube, my folks are on the way. You want them to give you a ride home?" "Nah, I rode my bike here, and you know I don't live far." "Yeah, but wouldn't you feel safer getting a ride home?" "Man, I'm not scared. Those kids weren't even taken from this area. Besides, I know how to kick somebody in the balls if they mess with me." "All right, Mr. Tough Guy," Tony said. "See you at school tomorrow then." Rube left and headed home on his bike. "Man, Rube is crazy," Tony said. Mike shook his head. "Hey, like you said, nobody wants Rube. He eats too much." Rube was not far from his house, and he was taking a long, dark road with hardly any streetlights home. But it was the quickest route. Headlights appeared behind him. At first, they seemed to be coming up slowly, but then they sped up. Rube turned around and saw how fast the vehicle was coming up on him. And not only that, they were right behind him. He pedaled faster, but the vehicle caught up with him really quick. Then, the bumper rammed into the back of his tire, sending Rube flying into a ditch. His head hit the hard dirt, and he almost lost consciousness. He lay there hurt and moaning. The vehicle stopped. Rube, through blurry vision, could see someone get out. The person seemed to be talking to someone. "You need to stop this. It's wrong. It's wrong." "But it's not your fault. He's lonely. He needs company. Someone to play with. He's all alone there." The person walked closer and became visible to Rube. It was Mr. Grady. Rube, still dazed, looked down and saw something in Mr. Grady's hand. It was a crowbar. Mr. Grady raised his arm and quickly came down with it on Rube's head. Everything went black. Mike and Tony's parents received calls from Rube's parents saying that he hadn't made it home that night. Both the boys told them how Rube had left home on his bike against their wishes. Rube became the latest kid to go missing again, and there were no leads. The town went into deep paranoia. There was a curfew set in place. Even the FBI had begun to investigate the matter of the missing kids. The only thing they knew is that it was always young boys taken. The person knew the area very well and was quite good at disappearing. The lead detective was very frustrated that someone was taking their kids like they were plucking apples from a tree. And there was absolutely nothing to base a case on. Mike and Tony stopped hanging out. They were too afraid to. The disappearance of Rube was just too close. They only talked on the phone. 2 months had gone by, but everyone was still on guard and tense. Everyone was sort of just waiting for news of another boy to go missing. Mr. Grady stood in his kitchen, staring out the window. He looked like an empty shell of a man. It was raining. He stared across the yard, looking at the old well. He began rubbing his hands together. He closed his eyes and slowly shook his head from side to side. He hummed as if humming a song with no particular rhythm. He stopped and opened his eyes. He stared at the well again. "Are you having a good time? Do you have enough friends to play with yet?" "Okay." Mike was on his way back from school, riding his bike, when he began to think about the way Mr. Grady had looked at him at the grocery store the other day. He looked at him like he wanted him. The look haunted him. He began to wonder if he might be the one who had kidnapped the kids around town. Against his better judgment, he decided to ride down the old farm road and see if he could find anything worth telling the police about. Mike was a curious kid. His parents would sometimes say, too curious for his own good. He rode down the old farm road and focused on the street and the passing street lines. They zoomed by. He was almost hypnotized by them. He knew he was getting closer to Mr. Grady's house because he could smell it. He pedaled faster. When he knew the house would be coming up, he took his eyes off the road and looked up. What he saw frightened him so bad, he almost lost control of his bike. Mr. Grady was standing in the middle of the road. His back was turned to Mike. He just stood there staring in the opposite direction. It seemed like a weird dream. The road was completely empty. There was no cars coming. The sound of the wind blowing through the trees was the only sound. Mike slowly pedaled up a little further and stopped. "Mr. Grady? Are you all right?" Mike nervously asked. Mr. Grady just stood there silently. "Mr. Grady?" Mike said again. But this time, Mr. Grady began to walk backwards towards Mike. He never turned around. He just walked backwards. Mike was terrified and began to turn his bike around and ride away. Just then, he heard footsteps coming up quickly behind him. A hard, callous hand slammed down onto the back of his neck and knocked him off his bike. Mr. Grady climbed on top of him and began to choke him. His lips receded back. A line of drool dripped from his mouth and landed on Mike's face. Mr. Grady looked up, remembering where he was, right in the middle of the road and fully exposed. He got off Mike, grabbed the bike, and threw it into the thick brush on the side of the road. The bike disappeared into the green foliage. He went back, picked up Mike off the ground, and began to drag him into the yard, towards the well. Mike coughed and began to catch his breath. He looked and saw Mr. Grady dragging him to the well. "No, let me go! Let me go!" Mike yelled. But Mr. Grady just dragged him on. As they got closer, Mike could smell whatever was inside the well. It smelled horrible. It smelled rancid. Mike knew he had to fight for his life at this point. He did not want to be thrown down that well. "Stop squirming, boy. This will all be over soon," Mr. Grady said. But Mike kept fighting. He reached back and scratched Mr. Grady's face. Mr. Grady grimaced and turned his head, but dragged the boy on anyway. Then in one last effort, Mike jammed his thumb in Mr. Grady's eye. The man let out a loud scream and let Mike go. Mike quickly ran through the yard and looked back and saw Mr. Grady on his knees. "You little bastard!" he yelled, but Mike just kept running. He didn't stop until he reached the road. He grabbed his bike out of the bushes and rode off faster than he'd ever rode in his young life. Mike burst through the door of his house, startling his parents. He was breathing heavily, "It's Mr. Grady," he said as he fell to his knees, crying and panting. His parents rushed over to him. "Mike, what's wrong? What happened to you? What do you mean it's Mr. Grady?" When Mike had calmed down, he explained everything that had happened, and his parents took him to the police station, and he told them what Mr. Grady had done. The police were shocked at this development. No one would ever have expected Mr. Grady. He kept to himself. He had no friends or enemies. No one ever even paid him any attention. The lead detective sat at his desk and shook his head. "I'll be damned, Mr. Grady. I can't believe this. All this time and right under our noses." My dad's a retired police officer. He was on the force for 40 years. I'm going to call him and see if he can tell us anything about Mr. Grady. When the detective's father had arrived, they explained to him what Mr. Grady was being accused of and told him everything that he had done to Mike. The old man sat down, took off his hat, and rubbed his hands through his thinning hair. He placed his hands over his mouth, covering his grayed beard. He sighed. "Oh, Grady, huh? Yeah, I know him. I was in my second year of the force when I first encountered Winston Grady. The man had a pretty rough childhood." Everyone sat and listened attentively. "Well, first off, he was the product of a rape. When his mother was about 16 years old or so, she was raped by an older boy. That boy was her cousin. Whole thing was kind of swept under the rug by her family. They were kind of well off and didn't want the embarrassment. So Grady's mother moved and bought that farmhouse till they both died of cancer and left her with the property. She hated Grady. They said every time she looked at him, he only reminded her of how he came into the world and what had happened to her. She abused that boy every chance she got. He was nothing more than a thing of misery to her. But the boy loved his mother. She was all he had. One day, Grady's mother met a man. I can't remember his name, but he hadn't been in town too long. Sort of a drifter, you know. He did odd jobs around town. Good-looking fellow, though. Anyway, not long after he wooed her and courted her for a bit, he ended up moving in with her. He was definitely loving in the lifestyle that came from being with her, as not only did she inherit her folks' home, but a hefty life insurance policy too. Well, eventually it came to light this was all he was after. He had no intention of building a real life with her. He was only in it for what he could get. He was also messing around with other women around town. Grady's mom ended up pregnant, and when she told him, he left her. But by this time, he had spent up a pretty good chunk of her money. She was devastated, went into a depression, and began to abuse Grady even more. When it came time for her to give birth to the baby, she had it at home with Grady's help. No one even knew she was pregnant because she stopped leaving the house. She did the bare minimum in caring for the baby, but Grady loved his little brother. He cared for that child like he was his own. He fed him, changed him, nurtured him. Grady had already dropped out of school, so most of his time was spent caring for the child. He loved his little brother's smile and his laugh. It made him forget all about the abuse he suffered at the hands of his mother. Well, one night, Grady sat playing with his little brother on the floor. The baby was about 1 year old by then. His mom just sat across from him and looked at him emotionlessly. "Look, Mama, he's smiling at you," Grady said. But his mother just stared at him like they were nothing. "You both are mistakes," she coldly said, got up and left the room. Later that night, Grady heard the back door slam. He looked out the window and saw his mother walking through the yard, holding an old suitcase. She walked toward the well and threw it inside. The next morning when Grady woke up and went downstairs, his little brother was gone. Grady looked for his mother, but she was nowhere to be found. back door was still open. He ran outside and saw his mother sitting in a large puddle of water. "Mama?" he called out, but she said nothing. "Where's brother?" But she just sat there looking into the beyond. Grady's mother was taken to a psychiatric hospital, where she stayed the day she died of natural causes. The house and land was both passed down to Grady. He told the police everything, told them about the suitcase his mother threw down the well, and how he thought his little brother was in it, but they didn't believe him. No one had seen her in so long, and most folks didn't even know she was pregnant. She's pretty much a hermit, and she had gotten rid of any evidence of a baby even being in the house. There wasn't much anyway. She claimed she was never even pregnant. Then the man who had gotten her pregnant was long gone by then, so he wasn't around either. A couple of us did feel she was lying though, but we never followed up with it. We just thought it best to put it behind us. Police never even looked in the damn well. Winston Grady has lived his whole life on that property by himself and bothered no one. Well, at least that's what we thought anyway. The detective stood up after his father had finished telling him everything about Winston Grady. "Let's go get him." Back at the farmhouse, Mr. Grady stood in the yard staring at the old well. He had a gun in his hand. He mumbled something to himself and began to walk over towards the well. He stopped at the well and looked down it. Flies flew out of the well and landed on his face. He waved them away. He smiled, and a fly landed on his teeth. "Baby brother." Mr. Grady turned around, sat on the edge of the well, and lifted the gun and put the barrel to his forehead. Mr. Grady pulled the trigger and blew his brains out against the weathered stone. His limp body fell backwards and down into the well. Shortly after, the police arrived and searched the house, but it was empty. They made their way into the backyards, into the well. They could smell it before they reached it. It wasn't pigs, it wasn't goats. It was the rotten smell of death. The detective saw the blood and small chunks of flesh against the edge of the well. He leaned over and peered into it and quickly withdrew his head back. The smell was overwhelming. "Give me a flashlight," he said to one of the officers. He covered his nose and mouth with his shirt and shined the light down the well. The color drained from his face when he saw what was down there. By the end of the ordeal, and after the well had been dug up, a total of 13 bodies of young boys had been recovered from the well. Some remains dated back years ago. Mr. Grady had been doing this for a long time. He'd been killing boys from all over the state and dumping their bodies down his well. The police spread their bodies out on the yard and covered them with sheets. The last thing they pulled up was an old suitcase. It was so old it looked to be from a different era. When they broke the old rusty latches on it, they discovered the skeletal remains of a baby, a little boy, Winston Grady's little brother. Hello all, and thank you so much for supporting the channel. If you've liked this content, please click the like button, share, and subscribe to receive notifications for new dark stories. Until the next time, be good to each other. It's a scary world out there.